Good Wednesday evening to you. This is Pastor Marty here at Cedar Grove Baptist Church, and we want to welcome you again to our Wednesday night Bible study. We're going to continue in the book of Acts, where we've been for the last few weeks. And so tonight we'll be looking at Acts 16. And I just want to start back at where we finished at last week and read through that passage into where we're at. Paul was in Europe, and he's had the first converts in Europe with Lydia. And so we're going to see what happens and how long it takes Satan to show up after God gets to doing something. So let's start in verse 12 of chapter 16. And from thence to Philippi, which is the chief city of that part of Macedonia, and a colony. And we were in that city abiding several days, or certain days. And on the Sabbath, we went out of the city by the riverside where prayer was wont to be made, and we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted thither. And we discussed that last week to some degree, and so you can go back and see that. I don't want to rehash that. Verse 14, and a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshipped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, and she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. And when she was baptized, and her household, she besought us, saying, If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us. And so we see Lydia, and Lydia is a seller of purple. She's from the area where Paul had desired to go into, and the Lord had forbade him to go into that particular area. And here we have a convert from that very area. It's just amazing how God works. And again, we see God supplying the financial need and the needs of Paul and his missionary team, which was 4 people, to have a place to stay and to have food and a connection into this particular city because as we said last week, by her being a seller of purple, she was financially well off. We see that. Now, Paul is here and he's starting a ministry, seeing God open the doors. Now, let's see what happens. How long does it take Satan to show up and try to derail God's work? Verse 16, and it came to pass as we went to prayer. So they're heading back down towards the river, probably. That's where they met the first time. A certain damsel, possessed with a spirit of deviation, met us, which brought her masters much gain by soothsaying. The same followed Paul and us, and we pointed out the fact last week that Luke uses those personal pronouns, plural personal pronouns, where he's including himself in these meetings, and cried, saying, These men are the servants of the Most High God, which show unto us the way of salvation. And this did she many days. All right, so let's just stop there and deal with this first part of this thing, because it is a very interesting story, and we need some information about this particular lady. So let me try to point out a few things that happens and a few things that does not happen. All right. So this damsel, verse 16, it came to pass when we went to prayer, a certain damsel possessed with a spirit of deviation met us. Let's talk about this girl. She's a slave girl. All right. So she's owned. She's in the Roman Empire. She is somebody's property. All right. She's a slave girl. But not only is she owned and controlled by probably wicked men who are using her to get money, because it definitely says that she brought her masters much gain. But she's also possessed or controlled or owned by Satan. The word there, the phrase spirit of deviation, is actually 2 Greek words. Spirit being pneuma being the wind or a spirit. It's only specific when it has qualifiers. In this case, there's a qualifier, but pneuma being the spirit, and then puton, or puto. Um, uh, that word means python. It's where we get our word python. And in this particular instant, puto is a mythical creature. It actually goes back to Apollo, the Greek god or the Roman god, Apollo, which was believed to be embodied in a python. Okay, and then the way that comes into this story is at Delphi, which is in the center of Greece. Delphi, there was a temple there, and they had a prophetess who could foretell the future. And this prophetess was said to be possessed by Apollo, by the spirit of Apollo. Apollo possessed her, and then he could speak through her and tell the future. And so this girl here, this slave girl, controlled by her masters, the men that owned her, was also controlled by a demonic spirit, and the people believed it was Apollo embodying her, and so she could foretell the future. Now, at this point, I want to say a lot. I really want to say a lot. First of all, there is a lot of wickedness in this world. And today there's a lot of things that possess people. And I really believe, and I know I'm going to get criticized, and some of you are probably going to turn this off. I encourage you to listen. I really do. But there's so much that people have been possessed by today. I was out of the country earlier this year, and a question was presented to me by a deacon of a particular church about exorcism, and I'm just going to tell you, as far as Marty Granger's concerned, God himself is going to have to really deal with my heart before I start going and thinking it's my job to exorcise somebody. Now, you may feel that way. I believe in demonic possession. I believe people are possessed by demons. I really believe that in our day. But there's demons out there today that I believe Satan's using. Satan is said in 2 Corinthians to be the God with a little g of this present age, of the age that we live in right now. And I believe that he uses all kinds of ways to possess people. People are possessed by alcohol. I know I was one of those people that, doggone it, I got up drinking and I went to bed drinking. So I can tell you that alcohol is something that will possess you, and it will ruin your marriage. It will ruin your health. It will ruin the way you think. I think Ephesians chapter 5 is one of the most visual pieces of scripture where Paul talks about don't be drunk with wine, and there's you a command, by the way, but be you filled with the Spirit. And the idea is the same way that alcohol controls you, that you should be controlled by the Holy Spirit that same way. Alcohol controls you. It controls the way you think. It controls the way you perceive things, things that come out of your mouth. Again, you can go look at Proverbs. I just read it the other day. A person says perverse things and does all kinds of actions, and then they turn around and do it again. Alcohol is something that possesses us. Something just as bad, if not worse than alcohol, is the drug situation today. There's so many people that they're addicted, call it addiction, but quite frankly, they are possessed with the drugs. And we think of things like heroin and cocaine and crystal meth and things like that. And yes. But there's another drug that has been legalized in many states, and it's just been we marginalized it now, and we're trying to say it's okay. And I'll never forget being at Daytona. This is before my walk with Christ. Being at Daytona, and one of my co-workers that was rooming with me told me all day long how marijuana was not addictive. Oh, it wasn't addictive, and you could quit anytime you wanted. And that evening, when he didn't think he was going to be able to smoke a joint before he went to bed, he went into a panic. You can't tell me he wasn't addicted. Okay, whether it's mentally or physically, he was addicted to it. We have people that's addicted to pornography, and it's something that just consumes them. We have people that are addicted to praise of other people. There's all kinds of addictions and possessions, and I believe Satan uses all of these things. But here we have this person that can supposedly foretell the future. That was my little rant, if you don't mind. My wife and I were in New Orleans on church business, of all places. It's where they had the national convention a few years ago, and we were there. Our church sent us there to voice our opinion about something that was going on. And one night, my wife and I, we went back out to New Orleans to go to this place where they service this dessert. And if my wife was here, she could tell you exactly what the name of the place is and what it was. But you had to walk through Jackson Square to get there. And I'll never forget when we entered into Jackson Square, just a feeling of oppression and evil that you felt in that place. And as I got to looking around, they were dozens, and I mean literally dozens of people that were reading people's palms and playing with tarot cards and had crystal balls. And these people were there trying to show these other folks what the future held. We have people that play with horoscopes, and they just can't do anything because the horoscope said that they couldn't do it. Bless God, either God rules or Satan rules. Okay? And in my world, God rules. All right? He does. But I'm telling you what, Satan is part of this stuff here. That was one of the most oppressive feelings that I've ever had as we went in there. And no doubt they was Baptists sitting right there. I guarantee you, this is as good as I'm sitting right here in this chair. There was Baptists right there that had fell into this game, wanting to know what the future holds. It's something. My God holds the future. I don't. And he reveals to me what he wants me to know. This girl was a fortune teller. She brought her masters much gain by soothsaying, by fortune telling. And she followed Paul and Silas around and the mission team. Now it's Paul, Silas, Luke, and Timothy. That's the four. And she's crying, saying, these men are the servants of the Most High God, which show us the way of salvation. Well, man, that's great, isn't it? We're getting free advertisement. This woman, she's renowned for her abilities, and she's proclaiming that we're serving the Most High God. We ought to just leave her alone, right? We ought to accept her praise, right? We're going to find that Paul didn't, and then we got to answer the question why. She did this many days, verse 18. But Paul, being grieved, he turned and said to the Spirit, I command thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And he came out the same hour. Boom. Now, why didn't Paul want to accept this free advertisement from this well-known personality? She was a fortune teller. She could tell the future. She was telling them, everybody, oh, he's a servant of the Most High God. Why didn't Paul want that? Well, if we were to look back at the Gospels, we would see that Jesus, in several occasions, when he was confronted with a demon, the demon knew exactly who he was, or in some cases, the multitude of demons knew who he was, and they would acknowledge who he was, and they would cry out who he was, and Jesus would always tell them to be quiet, to be quiet. Why? Why? You see, and this is hard for the church to understand today. We don't need Satan proclaiming who we are. Because what happens is when we get tied up with Satan, we get tied up with lies and trickery, and eventually it's going to taint the message. The message of Jesus Christ does not need Satan and his minions proclaiming it. We as the church need to proclaim it. And we need to learn how to separate ourselves even from things that seem okay. We need to separate ourselves from those things that may taint the message that we have. You see, by her identifying who they are and going around as their publicist and making proclamation, she's actually identifying her message with their message. We don't hear much about separation today in the church today. It's we need to all work together and we need to hold hands and put our differences aside and agree to disagree. And I'm so tired of hearing that. It's just not even funny. There's places that we can agree to disagree. And there's places that we need to put our differences to the side. But I'm going to warn you that when you hold hands with somebody, you start saying that person and what they practice is okay. And that you're willing to accept and overlook those practices. So you need to be careful of what you are accepting. Okay? Paul says, I'm not going to accept the witness of devils. Just like Jesus said he wouldn't. All right? And this he did many days, and he came out. Verse 19. Now I want you to look at what happens here. And when their masters saw the hope of their gains were gone, they caught Paul and Silas and drew them into the marketplace unto the rulers. Now, let's stop and talk about what Paul actually did. Here's another problem with the church. Just this week, I was speaking with a good friend, and we were discussing how hard it is to know how much of the social gospel you add into your ministry. Okay? If we look at Paul here, we see that definitely this girl is a slave. Now, there was different kinds of slaves, but in this particular instance, she was a slave probably of the lowest degree. She was owned and controlled by her masters. She had no say in what she done. There was other types of slaves that in the Roman Empire that was a little bit different. But in this particular instance, this is the type of slave, when we think of slavery, that's actually what we think of in the Western world. She was completely controlled by them. She had no say in where she went, what she done. She was owned by them. And Paul didn't go to her owners and say, look, you need to set this girl free. He didn't deal with the social injustices of what was going on. Paul didn't entangle himself with that. What Paul entangled himself with was the girl's spiritual condition. And I got to be careful because I don't want to get down the road of slavery today, but I don't ever see really that being the issue, the social issue. It was always the spiritual issue. And I just preached on it Sunday. Paul said, whatever condition I find myself in, I'm content. And I wouldn't be content to be a slave. I want to be set free. But at the same time, uh, if all of my concentration was around being set free, somehow or another, I wouldn't be able to serve God where I find myself. And that's that's a hard saying, but I just find it to be true. It's so hard to find the middle ground on where we need to be at. And I think in this particular instance, I think we can learn something. The gospel of Jesus Christ, untainted and untouched and unperverted from anything, should be what the church is about, first and foremost. Now, does that mean that we should never touch social issues? No. That I do not believe that is the case. Matter of fact, I believe especially in America, we have been given many privileges inside of the system that we find ourselves living in that no other place on earth has ever had. We're a government by the people for the people. It's not supposed to be a hierarchy ruling down on us. It's a government by the people for the people. And it's got to the point where it's not that anymore. But still, we have rights inside of America that no other nation has, and no other nation ever has had. And our system was built that way. Matter of fact, our forefathers built our system the way that it's built, just so we could throw off an oppressive government if it got to that point. So we do have rights in America, and we can't completely ignore the fact in the church that we have the ability to make a difference socially and to change ills that are going on. But it is a hard place to come to, and I would just suggest today, if you're struggling with that, to say the gospel first, unperverted, untainted. And if I have to water down the gospel, if I have to turn the other cheek, so to say, I'm ashamed to speak the word of God in the situation I find myself in. I need to separate from it. I'm going to give you an example of that. Our church was one of the founding churches of a ministry here in our community. And it was started out, there was many different denominations that worked together to try to meet the needs of people in the community, because churches the size of ours were just too small to have much of an impact. And yet we were inundated with people over and over again. Well, just a few years ago, this particular organization was taken over by a denomination, if you want my opinion, and they started working with the government so they could do more and not have to worry about the food bank having enough food in it or whatever. And up until that point, it had never run out of food. It had never run out of resources. God's people always came just in time. But they were tired of that. And so they started leaning on the government. And the government came in and said, well, no longer can you insist that people have to hear a gospel message. They can come in and tell you they're not interested in your gospel message, but yet you still have to give them food. And you can attach nothing to it. And at that point in time, I went to the leadership of our church and I said, we're pulling out of this. And we did. And not mad with anybody, but the gospel no longer was the number one thing. It became the social gospel. Let's feed their belly so they'll hear our message. That may be true sometimes, but I think if we look at the gospel, more times than not, Jesus' ministry was not feeding people. It was spiritually preaching to people, and then he fed them. Think about that a while. So anyway, we got to be careful. We got to be careful. People are hungry. People need help with their addictions. There's a lot of stuff, but the gospel needs to be first and foremost untainted, untouched by any social group. All right, we got to hurry because I'm getting close to out of time. But so we see that they drawed Paul and Silas. Now, personally, I believe that they took those two and left the other two for a reason. Luke was a Gentile. Timothy was part Gentile. Paul and Silas were Jewish. So there's some anti-Semitic undertones to this. They drew them out. As a matter of fact, they're going to tell you that. Look what happens. And they brought them to the magistrates, saying, these men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city. So they're causing problems. And they teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being Romans. So the accusation here, and I'm pulling this from Stephen Gare, was not their pocketbook, but this was patriotism. But that was not the truth. It was hid. Their actual agenda was hidden. They were not upset. They didn't have any problem with their slave girl running around behind Paul and Silas until their much gain was gone. So it was actually their pocketbook, but it was disguised as patriotism. Oh, Lord, help us in the environment we're living in right now. We could say there's a lot of people out there right now that are proclaiming patriotism. We have some people in the church that's claiming Christianity and this and that and the other, and our Constitution. But I believe a lot of it comes down to the pocketbook. On whatever side of the aisle you want to be on, I think it's amazing that it's almost straight down party lines. States like North Carolina, who are still closed down, who are still looking at 2 or 3 weeks before we can reopen. And we have a Democrat as a governor. And then we have other states that are Republican, and they're throwing caution to the wind, and they're opening up their states and saying, and I just can't help but think it's not politically based. It certainly looks like it. And even in our churches, this church saying this and that and that. We need to make sure our pocketbook and our politics are not what we are masking by our Christianity or our patriotism. We need to make sure our convictions are our convictions. Okay? And that's, we just leave it at that. I don't want to get down into political hoopla. Everybody has enough of that the way it is. But they're saying, this is the problem. Now, I want to say something, and it's not original with me. Matter of fact, I believe Phillips said this. There's only 2 times in the book of Acts, which is the history of the early church, there's only 2 times that we see the Gentiles spearheading the assault on the furtherance of the gospel. Only 2 times. Both times it has something to do with money. Here, it clearly says, they have one thing that's coming out their mouth, but the Bible clearly says that it was because she made them a lot of money and they seen that it was gone. And so then they start attacking the church, the furtherance of the gospel. The second time will be in Ephesus in just a chapter or 2 from now, when Paul's in Ephesus, and it'll be the silversmith union and it is a union, study your history, they attack Paul because their money's being messed up. So their business is hurting because of the gospel. And very interesting how much the gospel went forth in Ephesus. But with that said, I just think it's so funny that Phillips could see the only two times that the gospel is being attacked by the Gentiles first is when money's attached to it. I thought that was an interesting observation. All right, so they're actually saying something that's true in verse 21. It was illegal to have a new religion. It was illegal to proselytize from the Jews. They were a legal identified group. They could practice Judaism, but they could not proselytize, and so they were drug out for that particular reason. Okay, and at this particular time, verse 22, and the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates rent off their clothes and commanded to beat them. All right, so they laid stripes on them, many stripes, verse 23, upon them, and cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely. Who, having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in stocks. So I want to bring that out, and then I want to bring this up to date. Okay, they were given to the Roman jailer. He had his own private jail. That's the way we understand this most of the time. And so he was given a charge to keep them safely. So what that means is your life will be for their life if you don't keep them safely. And so he's going to put them in the middle of the prison. There's going to be 3 sections to this prison. They're going to be in the middle of it. And they're going to have their feet in stocks. All right. So he's going to make sure that and they're going to have guards on top of that. So he's going to make sure that they're kept safe because he don't want to give his life for their life. Now let's bring this thing up to date. They were beaten. They were put in prison. It's amazing that even today missionaries are faced with these same problems. They're faced with social ills. They're faced with, in a lot of cases, being in places where what they're doing is illegal. I mean, they're really illegal. Matter of fact, right here in America right now, there's a lot of churches that are defying the laws of the land, and they're saying, we're going to have church because God commands us to have church. Now, I'm not going to get into that argument there, one bit or the other, right now. But what I want you to see is people that are trying to be missionaries in places where Islam is the state or government law, and a lot of times it's not even the state law, but it is the law of the local area, and people, they become persecuted. Hinduism, certain places in India, you're in deep jeopardy if you're a Christian. They'll abuse you, they'll beat you, they'll kill you, they'll imprison you. Because in India, my understanding is each, what we would call state, has its own government. Much like what ours is supposed to have its own constitution. That kind of got thrown out the window a few years ago. But each one of these has different allowances, and some of them will tolerate Christian missionaries and some won't. But many missionaries live in fear of this very thing. Buddhism, oh boy, even Mormonism here in the States. You go out to Utah. I just had a class where my professor lived out there for several years. You go out there and try to practice anything besides Mormonism and see how things go for you. You may not be put in prison, but you'll definitely probably suffer for your faith. Roman Catholicism. There's places even today where Roman Catholicism is the political rule of the land. And there's not as many as it used to be, but they make it hard. And so any of these other religions, people will suffer for their faith because they're looked at as a false religion. We're looked at as different. And Satan, once he takes control of something, he's not going to give it up very easily. So we have missionaries today that, just like Paul and Silas, they suffer for their faith, and they're in fear of being imprisoned or worse in the areas God's called them to serve. So we need to pray for our missionaries, regardless of where they find themselves at. We need to pray for our missionaries. That's one of the things that we do here on a constant basis at our church, is we pray for those that God has called to missions. Missions is a very wonderful ministry, but missions can be a very lonely ministry as well. Many of my friends spend year after year, holiday after holiday, birthday after birthday, separated from their family. And so I know that those times are very difficult for them. And so we need to pray for these missionaries, for their safety, for their mental health, for their spiritual health. Well, this has been Pastor Marty. We'll pick it up next time. We're going to see what happens as God releases his missionaries from prison. Until next week, may God richly bless you.